Welcome. Thank you for coming, despite this blazing drizzle. This is the last public event of the semester for the Leon Levy Center of Biography. The Leon Levy Center was created at the Graduate Center and supported by a generous grant from the Leon Levy Foundation, for which we thank the trustee and one of the nation's leading philanthropists, Shelby White. And I'm delighted to say that Shelby is here this evening. And in fact, tonight was her idea. Everybody started talking about biographical ethics in the wake of the Paula Broadwell biography, which before then no one had ever heard of. The great American biographer, W. Jackson Bate, wrote at the outset of his classic biography of Samuel Johnson that Johnson loved biography more than any other kind of writing. He said that it provides what comes near to us, what we can turn to use. He then went on to argue that hardly a single life had passed from which we could not learn something if only it were told with complete honesty. Honesty, complete and otherwise, is the subject this evening, and the fallout from the scandal involving Broadwell and Petraeus, her subject. Much has been written about ethics in biography, but then ethics are always an issue, which is one reason biography is often frowned upon in the academy. To discuss these matters, we have a most distinguished panel. Unfortunately, one member of it, David Levering Lewis, had to cancel at the last minute for illness. But let me introduce you from my left. John Matteson is the Distinguished Professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Deputy Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography. He received the 2008 Pulitzer Prize in Biography for his first book, the richly eloquent Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father, and the 2012 Anne Sperber Prize for the Lives of Margaret Fuller, which he worked on as a Leon Levy Biography Fellow in 2009. John teaches biography as genre at the Graduate Center, and he is now at work on an annotated edition of Alcott's Little Women. Making her first appearance at a Leon Levy event is the ethicist Carol Levine. Carol directs the United Hospital Fund's Families and Healthcare Project, which develops partnerships between healthcare professionals and family caregivers. For 12 years, she was editor of the Hastings Center Report, a journal focused on medical ethics. In 1993, she received a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for her work in ethics and AIDS policy. She is a contributor to the Encyclopedia of Bioethics and has edited several books on bioethics and caregiving. Her forthcoming book, Living in the Land of Limbo, Fiction and Poetry about Caregiving, will appear in the coming year. Also making his first appearance here is the novelist Benjamin Anastas, whose first two novels, An Underachiever's Diary and The Faithful Narrative of a Pastor's Disappearance, were widely hailed as heralding a witty, individual new voice in American fiction. His short stories and essays have appeared in many publications, including Harper's and Granta. During the past few months, his new memoir, Too Good to Be True, which is for sale here, has triggered much controversy about an almost relentless truth-telling about personal and professional failure, both of which should now be at an end in the wake of this funny, moving, and highly original work. Please say hello to everyone. We're going to move beyond Broadwell quickly enough, but let me begin by asking if her lapse in judgment, the adulterous relationship with her subject, would be ethically acceptable if she declared her involvement in the biography. I'm going to start with Carol.
Oh, great. Easy question. I don't think it would change the ethics of what she did. And what they did. I think it might help the readers to evaluate the legitimacy of the writing about the book, writing about General Petraeus. You might have a different appreciation or lack of it by knowing this information. But I mean, I don't think that was going to happen. I don't know whether a publisher knew about this or not, but
Oh, I'm sure not.
sure not. I don't think her co-author knew about it.
No.
No, so, it was their secret, which raises some questions. Should she have at least told her co-author or her ghostwriter? After all. Oh, by the way, Vernon, there's this little thing going on between me and the general. Might have changed his mind about the work, might have changed the editor's mind about the work, and certainly would change the reader's mind about the work.
But there are all kinds of involvements between biographers and their subjects. I mean, even if we go back to Boswell, he wasn't sleeping with Johnson, but he worshipped the ground he walked on. He was a toady. Johnson couldn't bear his company at times. On the other hand, he was forthcoming about that, so we accept that. John.
Oh.
Okay.
You've got me thinking about the relationship between Johnson and Boswell, which was obviously a very strongly emotional one, though pretty clearly not sexual. There's a moment, I think, in the life of Johnson where Johnson just turns to Boswell after Boswell has been saying, "You love me, don't you? Don't you love me?" And Johnson just says, "Very well, I love you. Write it down. Don't ask me again." That sort of thing. I've been very interested, and this is not really a very good answer to your question, Gary, but if you want to press me on it, you're free to. I've been very interested by the treatment that Paula Broadwell has gotten, regardless of her status as a biographer, because she's really been painted as the Scarlet Woman, and she's been referred to as a slut, she's been referred to as a bimbo, and Petraeus has been referred to in sort of terms of very protective language. He's weak, he's a victim. It's a little hard to think of.
He's a man.
Yeah, well, there you go. But we are talking about, in Broadwell's case, we're talking about a West Point graduate. We're talking about someone with 2 master's degrees, one of them from the K School up at Harvard, and someone in the PhD program at King's College London.
In other words, smart enough to know that if you're writing a serious biography.
Yeah, smart enough to know that this is forbidden territory, but also someone of qualifications that really ought to take her out of the sort of presumptive bimbo category that she's been, I think, unfortunately placed in.
Well, there's a piece in the New Yorker today about Petraeus evaluating his abilities as a general. And nobody was even asking that question about him before this. You want to jump in on it?
Well, I mean, I have to admit that I'm a little bit of a loss here because there's no salacious material in the book. It wasn't a book that kind of uncovered any extramarital affairs that Petraeus was having. So I feel like if it's not in the book, it's really none of our business.
It's not our business.
Yeah.
But it's our business now because we know that the book is, well, the book was so worshipful to begin with.
Sure.
That, I mean, I haven't read it, but that's what one hears. Let me bring it to your memoir. You're too young to have grown up with Lenny Bruce. But one thing that
I grew up in the shadow of Lenny Bruce.
One thing that Lenny Bruce repeated often was never tell. Never admit. Even if she walks in and finds you in bed, say, "I don't know how she got here. I never saw her before." You could not keep from telling. And the memoir is a book that is really rather astonishing in the candor. The question I have, even though you change things, you disguise names, it's become a kind of contest who you're writing about. If you write about your own life and you reveal as much as you do about yours, do you have a responsibility to the other people who intersect in your life?
Oh, absolutely. In writing about real people, you have a very real and kind of palpable responsibility. You know, their lives are very much in your hands. I wanted to be clear, I wanted to be sure that everybody who was actually in the book and is depicted in it in a major way saw the manuscript before it saw the light of day, to at least give them, I didn't want anybody to be blindsided. I wanted them to know that I was writing about their lives. Over the second step is giving the book a legal reading with a media attorney, just to make sure that I was doing enough work to disguise everybody who was in it so they wouldn't be kind of immediately recognizable, both to protect myself and also to protect their privacy. Now, there's a certain kind of play that I engage in. It's not too hard to figure out who a couple of the key characters are. Particularly this character called the nominee, who is this writer who had an affair with my wife.
You just have to look up the National Book Award.
So I figured the low-hanging fruit people will figure out anyway, and I would just sort of put up enough of a smokescreen that there would be some difficulty there. But
you're not aggrieved at exposing.
I don't know that I'm really exposing anyone. I think you know, a lot of standards have changed, and I think in some ways this is separate from the Petraeus thing, which is blown up into this massive thing. But you know, books have become a kind of proprietary media. If you compare a book to a Twitter feed or a Facebook page or somebody's blog, there really aren't that many people who see it. And honestly,
That's discouraging.
it is quite discouraging. But so I feel like the weird place that we're in now is that if you write something in a book and publish it, it's kind of private.
Hiding in plain sight.
I'm speechless, yeah.
Ethics distinction here.
Please.
What ethics does is make distinctions. There's a distinction in ethics between harming someone, which means either physical harm, mental anguish, causing them to lose their job or their book contract or whatever, and wronging someone, which is an insult to their dignity, their personhood, their sense of themselves, which can go even to the group to which they belong. And I think you can prevent harm from someone. It's harder to prevent wrong because that's in the eye of the beholder. You know, I feel offended. I mean, there was the letter to the Times it was about the book review of the Patriarch, not about the book itself. I mean, whatever Joe Kennedy did, that was okay with his daughter, Jean Kennedy Smith. You can't talk about my mother that way. She wasn't humorless. I mean, if I'd been married to Joe Kennedy, I think I wouldn't have had a sense of humor either. But there's a sense of people feeling horribly wronged by what has been said about them. Even if they're disguised, they know who it is. So, you know, there's something you can think about in those obligations.
Sure.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
The mics aren't.
Oh, sorry.
Put the
okay.
mics up a little closer.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
About a minute before I took this seat, there was an audience member who asked me if I had ever slept with Louisa May Alcott.
And did you come clean?
Well, we were just good friends, actually. But it's very interesting to hear people talk about duties owed to the living. There are obviously legal duties against libel and slander, and you and I, Gary, as biographers, know that those all go away at the moment that the heart stops beating, that it's legally impossible to slander or libel a dead person. And you and I both have, we know, sadly, people who take that as absolute carte blanche. They can just lie their fannies off about a dead subject. And I think one of the assumptions that people tend to make is that people who write about dead subjects don't feel any sense of moral obligation. And I have found that I have felt a sense of moral obligation, and that it has varied depending upon the person I'm writing about. Okay, may I give a case in point?
Please do.
Okay, yeah. Louisa May Alcott was an extremely private person. She was somebody who did not like people, probing her personal life. There were stories about her actually trying to turn a garden hose on reporters who came to Orchard House in Concord to shoo them away. And she was also someone who never said a word about her private life. Now, here's this woman who lives to the age of 55, is vivacious, interesting, smart. In her earlier years, certainly not unattractive, but has evidently no history of ever having had a lover. And so, the question has arisen among some people, well, what was the story there? Was she gay, and was she trying to conceal her lesbianism, something like that? And when I was writing Little Women, or I wasn't writing Little Women, it was right. It was, yes, it can now be told. No, I'm working on the edition of Little Women, so that's why the slip. But when I was reading Eaton's Oddcast, this thought came to me, should I explore this? But since there was no smoking gun, for one thing, there was no evidence, but also because my subject was someone who clearly, did not like that sort of intrusion, I felt as if I really ought to step back a bit and not press in the way that I might have with someone who was more open about their lives as they lived them. Now, Margaret Fuller had very strong, erotic feelings toward other women and wrote about them in her journals. And so in the Lives of Margaret Fuller, I discussed that aspect of her much more freely because, A, there was a written record, there was evidence, but I somehow felt that I wasn't intruding in a way that I would have with a more private, more guarded subject.
Well, this brings up the whole subject of the limit of what it is possible to know.
Of course.
And at what point do you just step back? Or conversely, do you feel obliged to use whatever you find just because you found it?
Yeah. If in fact I had, found it, evidence that Louisa May Alcott had tried to kill Ralph Waldo Emerson or something like that, yeah, I certainly would have come out with that. I would have felt an obligation then to the reader to discuss truth. Now, and this. But
you didn't feel an obligation to pursue her sex life.
And isn't that interesting? Okay, and that may have something to do with the categories that I have in my own mind. Okay, wow. And if that's true, if it's all dependent on my personal sense of what's fair play and what's not, maybe I'm already injecting myself too much. Okay, and perhaps I should have a set standard that goes across the board for every subject, for every situation, but I would not want to be pinned to that. For one thing, what biographers do, we tell truth, but we also shape stories. And we exercise judgment as to what we include and don't include. If you try to include everything, the book would be as long as the life, and you'd never get anywhere. And any time that you start making judgments about inclusion or exclusion, you're almost de facto making ethical decisions, whether you're conscious that they're ethical or not. And there is no code for biographers, so far as I'm aware, as there would be for priest penitent or for psychiatrist or so on.
It's the absence of a code,
yeah,
or standards or ethics that brought us here.
Yeah, this raises to me an interesting comparison. First of all, I just thought of from Emily Dickinson, tell all the truth, but tell it slant, which means not tell everything that's important to know, but you don't have to dump it on people, and you don't have to, make something that is out of nothing or out of very little. I mean, think of the relationship between, say, a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist and a subject. To me, it seems though the biographer's relationship with a living subject is more intimate in some ways than the psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are limited by what they can do, they can't go into your emails, they can't interview your former lovers or your political rivals or anything, but the biographer can do all of that and know more about you than maybe things that you don't even recognize as yourself. So the rules that govern psychiatry are not quite as strong. They don't really cover biography because of the breadth of inquiry that a biographer can do.
Well, we had an example of that here last week. Joyce Johnson was here, Kerouac's biographer. And
who had had a relationship with him, right?
She had a love affair with him for 2 years. There was nothing adulterous or underhanded about it. But clearly, she was very young then, and she wrote a memoir in '83, a marvelous memoir, in which she talks about Kerouac as she knew him. She happened to be there at the very moment that On the Road was published, and suddenly his whole life changed, and he didn't know how to handle that fame. As you just said, though, the biography is far more intimate than her memoir, because, and I asked her about this because if you think of it in terms of your own lives, if you think of a lover that you had 20 years ago, investigating her life, talking to all the people who knew, there's something really
creepy about it.
I think there is. And yet, what she's so focused on his writing and the craftsmanship that will surprise many people, that I think and also she's very forthcoming. In the first 3 pages, she just lays it out and then moves beyond it.
Yeah.
So if Paula Broadwell had just sort of laid it out in the foreword that I'd been having an affair with General Petraeus,
then we would know what we would factor that in.
because I think one of the reasons, again, this is totally outside my sphere of expertise, but I think one of the reasons everyone's so interested in the story is because they had sex. There's sex there, but I feel like the kind of breathless biography that she produced is not so different than a lot of other authorized biography, and the only difference is that they were sleeping together.
Right. There's no evidence that David McCullough slept with Harry Truman. One might suspect as much. But the same thing happens also did I say something? in the other direction, where people set out to write pathographies or just viciously undermine someone's credibility. And
James Atlas and Saul Bellow comes immediately to mind.
That certainly does, and then the Kitty Kelly type, she wrote a 500-page biography on Sinatra in which she doesn't mention that Sinatra was a singer until about 400. And then there are the books that John was referring to by, especially the Hollywood writers, hacks who turn out a book a year. They wait for somebody to die, and then they can say whatever they want. And they will interview someone and just report. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the method. You write about the dead, but let's talk about it generally speaking.
Sure.
How seriously should one take an interview about someone who you're writing about who's now dead? Do you simply go with it? Do you factor it in as information? Or do you protect yourself by saying, this person told me? Or do you look for somebody else who might be able to confirm or build on it?
Well, I think you're making a terrible mistake if there are other sources out there that you can probe and you don't, because you just have this one interview and you want to rely on it. Individual memories are notoriously faulty. People, particularly if you're, talking with, with people who have been out of the limelight for a while, or aren't getting a lot of attention. They have some motivation to say interesting but untrue things just because you're there with a microphone. And
because they're lonely and don't want you to leave.
Exactly. And so one needs to exercise some kind of judgment. I think that when you have contradictory stories, if you've got the space, if your editor will let you do it, is to try to give both sides. I'm much more interested as a biographer in starting conversations than I am in finishing them, right? I like the idea of having two separate opinions about something to maybe start a discussion around a water cooler. If there are people in the world who are interested in Margaret Fuller and hang around water coolers, I don't know if they are, but let me know. I don't think it's necessarily the job of the biographer to reach ultimate conclusions. We obviously have to reach conclusions at some level, as I said previously, about what we're going to include or exclude. But the ultimate decision about what the story is, I think is more interesting if it resides with the reader than if it does with the writer.
All right. Carol?
I agree with that. I think that it's very hard to know exactly what is truth in these situations. There isn't a a single truth. Everybody will have a different way, but you need, as a reader of biographies, I want to feel that the biographer has explored this subject, and I mean the subject, and in the context. I want to know about the times in which this person is living, what they did. I want to feel that at the end of it, that I have somehow been there with that person, and I've undergone whatever decisions or life changes or whatever. So it's not that I need to know everything, it's what I need to know the most important things, and it's got to be a good story, otherwise why do it? I mean, the person has a life that, if you've chosen this person because the person obviously accomplished something or was critical in some way, so what was it? What made that person that way, and what did that person do? And you can uncover all sorts of, flaws or contradictions, but not in a way that detracts from appreciating the life of this person. Maybe a little apart from ethics, but it's, as a reader, I want that. And I think the best biographies do that for you. You feel you know this person now. You know this person, why they did what they did.
I don't know if...
I don't know, I don't think reading General Petraeus about him, I think you don't understand anything about him. I mean, it sounds like, oh my gosh, it's so good.
It's like a press release.
Yes.
I don't know if this is true of most readers, or you or Ben, but biographers tend to read source notes. I'm always fascinated when I'm reading a biography and there's a fact in there and you just think, how the hell can they know that? And I always keep 2 bookmarks in there, one so I can go right to the source note. This is, though, an aspect of modern biography. You don't find source notes in Sandberg's Lincoln or Eminent Victorians and most of the classic, certainly not Boswell. What I find fascinating, and this came up with Joyce Johnson last week, and I'll give an example of this without naming the name of the biographer. He was writing about James Agee, and he is describing him as a young man masturbating. Well, I went right to the source note. I mean, was there somebody hiding in the bed? How the hell could he possibly know this? So naturally, it's not sourced. So I ran into him and I said, where did you get that from? And he said, well, everybody knows Agee was the most autobiographical of writers. Now, to me, that's really crossing an unacceptable line. You can say in the narrative that this is not an unfair conclusion to come to based on the way he wrote about it, but you can't just put it in there.
Yeah.
Well, the other interesting situation arises when there's this wonderful story about your subject, and you track it down, and you discover that it's completely apocryphal, right? That it could not have happened. Okay, thinking, for instance, about the allegedly famous scene where Henry David Thoreau is in jail for not having paid his tax to support the Mexican War. Ralph Waldo Emerson allegedly comes to him in jail and says, "Henry, why are you here?" And Henry, in saintly fashion, says, "Waldo, why aren't you here?" And it's so perfect, and you just want to go with it, and you discover that there's absolutely no documentation for it at all, that it is folklore.
Oh, it's like a few weeks ago, David Nassau here just destroyed my day by convincing us that Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger. I mean, very, very disappointed in that.
I'm curious if there was ever a source found for that apocryphal story about Thoreau and Emerson. I mean, is it just sort of a popular story that they can't be traced, or is it?
Well, you go back a certain way and you discover that every time it comes up, there is no sourcing for it. Oh. And I'm foggy on it now, but it may have been a situation where Emerson wasn't even in town, something like that. Okay, which is
it's that category of, well, it may not be true, but it ought to be true.
Exactly.
So we believe it.
Yeah.
But it's not that far from Parson Weems and George Washington's.
And ditto Lincoln with Harriet Beecher Stowe saying, "So you're the little lady who started this big war." There's no proof that he ever said that. They did meet, but nobody wrote down anything at the time about their meeting.
I want to ask you, when you were writing your book, how long did it take you to write?
I wrote the book pretty quickly. It took me a little less than a year to finish a draft.
Were there moments, did you write passages where you thought, no, I can't? I don't mean just from the writing point.
Actually, there's a lot I left out. But you know, one of the funny things about autobiography as opposed to biography, it's part of your task is actually to kind of uncover the salacious material and bring it to light. I mean, you know, autobiography, as we know it, really starts with St. Augustine's Confessions, and the most memorable parts of the Confessions are, you know, when he's stealing pears with the hooligans, when he's writing about his concubine, when he's talking about being a Manichaean, when he's at the Colosseum with Alypius. And there's a great story about Alypius, who is convinced that as an ethical person, he will go to the Colosseum and watch the games, but he will cover his eyes as soon as they throw the captives to the lions, because, you know, he's too ethical to indulge in that. But of course, he's there with his friends, other students, and he watches through his fingers, and then the next thing you know, he's addicted to going to the Colosseum. So I think it's sort of understood that what part of what autobiography delivers is sort of summed up in this prayer that Augustine sort of says to himself in Carthage, you know, which is, you know, grant me chastity and continence, but not yet, which is his famous prayer. The not yet is really kind of the substance of autobiography. If we don't get to the sort of the heart of these sort of salacious things that we do before we gain wisdom, before we grow beyond it, then the story of the conversion, the story of the passage isn't nearly as powerful.
Did you have a narrative line in the way you do as a novelist, writing about yourself?
Sure. I found it in a sense. The way I wrote this book is I was at a very tough point in my life, and nothing was working, as I say in the foreword. You know, I had a marriage that failed. I was the father of a son who I didn't see as much as I wanted to. My sort of career as a writer had tanked. I wasn't making any money. I had debts everywhere. And so I started going into my son's room with a notebook and sitting on his bed when he wasn't there and just kind of writing in longhand to write about where I was in life and trying to figure out how I got there and how I could get myself out. So the truth is, when I started writing, I didn't even know I was writing a book. But then after a few months, I realized, you know, this could actually be something. So I was writing about these things as they were happening. So the storyline, in a way, was dictated by how life went. So it was only after I got to the end of the process that I realized what the storyline was.
After the book was written, or
after the draft was written?
The draft, and then when you knew it, did you go back and have to revise accordingly?
Sure, I went back and I structured. I didn't change events, but I changed the order of how they were kind of put in the book.
You look like you weren't.
I'm wondering whether a lot of the ethical questions come down to issues of property and ownership. Yeah. Do you own your life? At what point, if you do own your life, at what point do you stop owning your life? You know, one of the things that Ted Hughes used to say to people who, you know, came after him for the Sylvia Plath story was, you know, I should hope that we finally own the facts of our own lives. And I'm not sure that we do. I think that once an act is done, you've sort of lost control over it, you know. And once a word is said, you have no control over where it's going to go. Well, one of the reasons why you have to watch what you say.
My favorite example of this, I've told this often because it's a cautionary tale for biographers. But when I started researching Bing Crosby, and I was about to make my first research trip in LA, I was on the plane reading a biography of Grace Kelly, the first one that appeared about her. And there was a story in it that just didn't seem kosher to me, so I went right to the source notes. And the book is well sourced, but this anecdote is not sourced. So when I arrived, I had a researcher there, and I asked her to see if she could get this guy's number. And I called him, and you know, I said, love your book, but there's this one story, and before I got it out, he said, don't tell me it's the one about, and I said, yeah, and he said, well, this guy told it to me, and I shouldn't have gone with it, but he kept saying he had it on tape, and he was going to give me the tape, and then I had to get the book finished, and I probably should have taken it out, but I went with it. And then I told him, a couple of reasons why it could not possibly have happened, and I could hear him dying a little bit on the phone. Well, the punchline of this is that years later, maybe 7, 8 years later, I'm at the Strand, which I made periodical visits to look at the show business section and check out everybody's index. And now there's a shelf of books about Grace Kelly. There's 5 or 6 books. And every one of them has this story sourced to James Spader, the original guy. So if you were about to write a biography of Grace Kelly and you found this anecdote in 6 books, would you even question its veracity?
Yeah. That's who owns your life? I mean, if I'm remembering correctly from F. Scott Fitzgerald basically took Zelda's life and made it his own in a way that she complained about because she fancied herself a writer as well. So I don't think any one person, I don't think you can own your life because unless you're a hermit and you live on the top of a mountain, because your life is interconnected with people. And that's basically one of the, you talk about ethics as rules. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do this. But basically it comes down to relationships. What do we owe each other in our relationship? And different relationships have different obligations, not always clear, but it seems to me, in a biography, you do have relationships, and you do have external ones like the readers, the editors, the co-authors, the whatever. So you have both people in the life and people who are going to be reading or working with your book that you have to think about.
Well, Carol, you said that when you read a biography, you want to have a sense of the person's life and the value of it. Are you conscious of at the moment when you think the biography is veering into gossip or?
Yeah, I'm conscious when I'm conscious of when I feel the biographer is trying to convince me of something about this person that I am not quite convinced about, that the evidence that I'm reading about doesn't, or that all of the evidence is in one direction, that I think, well, gee, there must be another side to this story. Nobody's either that good or maybe with a few other examples, that bad, that I feel the biographer is pushing his or her own agenda on the life of this person. So I do bridle at that. I also look at source notes, but not to the extent you do.
And I think that if a biographer does have a controversial point to make, one of the ways of doing it is to present your evidence in such a way that the reader thinks that they're getting there 2 pages before you do, right? Going back to the example of Louisa May Alcott, I became rather convinced during my writing about her that she suffered from some sort of lesser degree of bipolar disorder, just from the way that she would write, where she would just write obsessively for a couple of months on end, barely stopping to sleep, barely stopping to eat, and then just completely crashing and pulling the curtains and ill for months, and then she would fire it up again. And there was also pretty definitely some bipolar disorder in her father's family. And yet no Alcott biographer had ever touched the issue before. I felt that I needed to because the evidence to me was pretty compelling. But what I then did was I started sort of sowing my narrative with clues as to that was where I was going, so that by the time that I actually did drop the bomb, my reader already was prepared for it and had already in his or her mind the evidentiary foundation for what it was that I was then going to say. And maybe some of this goes back to my early professional training as an attorney. You want to build up, you want to lay the evidentiary foundation before you make the closing argument. It's a little bit different there because you're really then trying to push one particular conclusion. And I think the biographies that do that are overly tendentious, as I suggested before, are not necessarily good biographies.
What about biographies that fudge the limits of knowledge with phrases like perhaps maybe, one may imagine, he must have thought?
I think you can finesse that too, in a way that is, for one, doesn't look as fishy on the page, and for another, doesn't seem to offend certain codes of style. There was, for instance, a point that I wanted to make about in my all-cut book. I wasn't really sure that it happened that way, and so I wrote, "It's fun to suppose that." Okay, giving it sort of a spirit of levity in a sense, but not saying perhaps or he must have thought. I think it's heavy-handed, and you do it more than once, and people really get the clue that you're on thin ice.
Do you read biography?
I do.
And what are standards?
I'm trying to think the last biography that I read, but I'm going to blank because the pressure's on,
Yeah. There's going to be a quiz in the morning.
But for a piece I've been working on, researching on publishing. I've been reading a lot of autobiographies by people who worked in publishing, Bennett Cerf, Horace Liveright. So I guess I'm more steeped in autobiography now than I am in biography.
And at what point do you trust or not trust?
Well, I think the wonderful thing about autobiography is that you're getting someone's personal account. And there are facts that are verifiable, but for the most part, you're getting their version of events and their version of what happened. So they can't really be wrong unless it's something that's verifiably false, My mother died in...
I'm asking
it's
this...
actually,
Right.
May I interject?
1947.
And I was read all weekend.
Not much to be
And
believed.
I love research and Horace Liveright. I even met his daughter.
You have a good crowd here at CUNY.
Tread carefully, why?
Well, when Bennett was an extraordinary that the story and its effect upon the farmer and the rest. And that held true in his life.
Okay.
Well, but I would just argue that we read books like this for the expression of the figure's personality more than we read them to find out a historically accurate record of their dealings. It's more of just like the
and the personality shines through.
Mm-hmm.
There's truth in personality, but there is another line.
Sure.
All right.
Do biographies have fact checkers who go on and...
A good publisher will provide a fact checker to some point, but you're doing the fact checking, and occasionally I've had fact checkers find things, but I did a couple of pieces for the New Yorker, and New York is famous for its fact checking, and I was writing about a famous piece of music from the 20s called the Tar Paper Rag. And I mistyped it as Tar Baby Rag. And this piece was fact-checked up and down. It went through 15 different galleys. This was before everything was digitalized, and if they changed a semicolon to a comma, you got a brand new galley. And it still appeared in the magazine as Tar Baby Rag. So,
Did readers then call you on it?
They wrote letters.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
Okay.
of course.
Yeah, because I have found that the best fact checker is always the reader 2 weeks after it's published.
Yeah. Well,
And I've gotten a story about that.
I'm sorry, can you?
I wanted to comment on this issue of checking sources swimming around. Because just checking sources, there are biographies, even those that win Pulitzer Prizes, that use phony source notes, such as, in my biography, has a section in the back, note on sources, where I outline by the first biographer of Jackson Pollock, my interview, right, going to primary sources, he assured me that he invented the characters, he invented all the dialogue, and the novel in question was about a photographer and a non-artist wife. It had nothing, the character was not based on the character. Another measure said,
Well,
Presner said in the novel, it has Presner speak as direct dialogue.
I get the point. I think we would all agree that that's unethical. But on the side of those of us who make occasional errors, I love to tell the story about Richard Schickel, who's a wonderful biographer and critic, who was on a panel, I think in D.C. And when it got to the Q&A, he was on a panel with 4 or 5 biographers. Somebody stood up and addressed one of the other biographers with great truculence about a very minuscule error in the book. And the biographer was about to respond, and Richard said, "Do you mind if I take this one?" The guy said, "No." And Richard went, and I'll try to do my imitation. He said, "You know, all of us up here are very serious about what we do. We spend years writing these biographies, years, with very little hope of any kind of remuneration. We do everything we can to get all our facts right. We check and we check and we check. But no matter how much we do, there will always be a few errors that creep in. And there will always be an asshole like you to point them out." I'm not talking about you.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that the same biography that gave us the scene of the young Jackson Pollock peeing on a rock and inventing drift painting? So I think that biographer was really a novelist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Two?
And yes, there are a lot of elements which one could describe in fiction, but I don't think that that's standalone example, and it's one of the reasons that biography is a bad name, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
in the academy. So there are different sorts of biography.
Well, the reasons that biography has a bad name in the academy is a pretty long list, and some of them are very justifiable, like the one that you've raised, and then there are things that just have to do with philosophy, like in literary biography. Well, we don't care about the author; we care about the text. The author was killed back in the 1920s and 30s. What do we care about the author? Anything that you have to say about the author is not scholarship, and we're not interested. Okay, that can crop up. I can't tell you how much it pains me to hear about an allegedly serious biographer who willfully fabricates. Because Gary's right. I think most of us, I certainly know that I do, try very, very hard, but we can't always get there. And it's annoying as heck because you know that you're holding yourself out as an authority, and that what you say people are going to take seriously if they read it and in the way that it's intended. And inevitably there will be, and once again, I'm not really speaking to the situation that you've raised. I have deep respect for your indignation at having found something that was not verifiable and that so misrepresented the subject. But in Eden's Outcasts, I tried my level darndest to recreate Concord. And so I went to Concord several times and paced off the distances between houses to see how long would it take Louisa May Alcott to have walked to Emerson's house and things like that. And also the flora and the fauna. And I noted the fact that there were cardinals flitting around in the trees. I thought, oh, nice detail from the book. I'm going to talk about the cardinals in the springtime in Concord. So I did. And I got an email from an ornithologist after I'd published saying, "Cardinals did not come to Concord until the 20th century. How dare you?" But the only thing that I found that I could do was to write an email back saying, "Thank you very much. We'll fix it in the succeeding editions." And I think that the best response is one of humility, and to realize that you can't know it all, but if you can know something more than you did because someone pointed it out, you should really tip your hat and say thank you.
The place where you usually get caught up is the stuff that you know. The stuff you know so well that you don't
Oh, God.
double check, you don't look it up. That's
So
where
true.
you make.
So true.
Yeah. But that's not, I mean, that's not ethics per se. I mean, that's part of the process of doing this stuff, of any kind of writing, really, where you want to make sure it's right and you do what you can, and, you know, inevitably there's something is wrong. You spell somebody's name wrong, oh my God. But, you know, I'm more concerned about the portrayal of the person or the portrayal of what the person did writ larger, so that you would get a skewed picture, maybe not false, but certainly not the whole picture. And I think that happens too in some biographies, but that's not the same sort of problem we're talking about.
But you did something remarkable, John, in that Eden's Outcast. You, after creating an extremely compelling and eloquent portrait for several hundred pages, at the very end, you say basically, but it's really impossible to understand the dynamics.
Right. Yeah, because
of the way a family works.
Yeah, there's so much that doesn't get written down. You know, the reassuring pat on the shoulder, the kind word or the not so kind word that is said in haste perhaps and is forgotten the next day. You know, all of that gets lost. And one of the things, and I think this does go back a little bit to ethics, is that biography shows one, particularly if you're working on a subject who is perhaps recently dead, the value of every individual human life, because every human life has unique stories to tell. And the stories that get preserved are a thimbleful out of that ocean of human experience. And as a biographer, as I said earlier, you want to keep it all. You want to save it all. You want to know everything. And Bronson Alcott actually in his journals said, you know, I can't live life and record it at the same time. Yeah, and that's the tragedy that we always run into.
Let's talk about the ethics of letters. This, I don't know if this is applicable to somebody that from a previous century, but I find letters almost always helpful. They always tell the truth, even if the person is writing a lie. The fact that the person wrote that lie is the truth.
Right.
But there are letters that I've been reading lately that I really feel these were not intended for my eyes or anybody else's.
Yeah.
And maybe Carol, you can address the border at which you pull back.
I mean, I think the border is the same as any other kind of information. The information is in the letter. It won't be a problem in 20 years. We won't have any letters. It will all be,
that's right.
You know, so let's not worry about it too much. But I think having it written down is some sense that this was important enough in this person's life to write it, and important enough in the person who got the letter to keep it. So there is something weightier about it to me than it would be if it were another kind of communication.
If we were to limit ourselves to material that the writer only that which the writer wanted published,
well, clearly,
we couldn't do Emily Dickinson's poetry.
Right.
And imagine what a loss that would be. I don't know what you're discovering in those letters. I hope you can tell me at some point in less mixed company.
I'll use it.
Yeah, but it's a matter of conflicting duty, isn't it? There's a sense of duty that you feel to your subject, even though your subject may be dead and legally, physically can't be harmed. But on the other hand, there's the duty that you have to publish the person's legacy, warts and all, and that's part of what we're, in a sense, supposed to be doing. But I think it's just a sign, Gary, of your basic decency, that it concerns you, that it bothers you. That may be finally all that can be asked. But I do think.
Well, here's the thing, John. If somebody is having a terrible day and is in really a pissed off mood and writes a vicious letter that is in really not characteristic. And you put in the book that he was going through a terrible thing, and he wrote this letter. The reader doesn't read that as this momentary moment. Those words stick out, and they assume an importance that they might not otherwise.
You think that's true no matter how you bracket it, even if
No,
you
I
say
think you
that
have
it's
to
an
work at
aberration?
bracketing it. I think you have to really work to put things in perspective as you learn them.
Sure.
And as you were saying about Pollock, there are so many instances where people take one factoid and make that the story of the person because the sensationalism.
I have something to add to this, actually.
Yeah.
I faced a very similar dilemma when I was working on my book. I was writing about this very early age of my life. I was 3, and my parents were divorcing, and my mother was severely depressed and suicidal. Can't hear me? Is that better? My mother was severely depressed and suicidal, and I was trying to kind of reconstruct this period of my life. My mother had gone to this experimental therapeutic treatment place for the summer. And this is, the title of the book is Too Good to Be True, and the title comes from this therapy that we underwent. My mother was in group therapy all day long, and my brother and my sister and I were also in therapy while she was in therapy, even though my sister and I were 3 and my brother was 7. And the only thing I really remember from the summer is this day where we had to wear these signs around. They'd been sort of watching our family and noting the roles that we played. And my older brother had to wear a sign that said Mr. Know-It-All. My sister had to wear a sign that said Cry Baby. And I wore a sign that said Too Good to Be True. And obviously this is a memory that had haunted me for a long time. And I'd always wanted to kind of understand what it meant. And as I was working on the book, I talked to both my parents about it, and they really didn't remember very much about that summer at all. But my father did this kind of amazing thing. He went into his safety deposit box where he keeps his journals, and he was looking to see what if he had journal entries from that year. And he was looking through, and he found this folder that had my parents' divorce decree in it. And inside this folder was this short story that he had written called Old Friends, which was about this period, this very period in my family's life. In it, my parents are fighting a lot. My father becomes violent. At one point, he throws a chair at my mother, or the character is my mother, and sends her to the hospital. But it explained a lot about what had been happening in my family during this period. So he gave this story to me, and he said, "You can really do whatever you want with it. I'm just happy that I found it, and that it helps you." Helps you discover what happened during this period of my life. So I decided, as I was working on the book, that I'm not gonna put the story itself in it, but I'm gonna describe the story and what happens to it. So I was faced with the dilemma of sort of exposing this material that obviously makes my father look really bad. It's difficult for my mother because she's a very accomplished person, and I'm writing about this period in life when she was suicidal and hospitalized. But to go back to the point you were making earlier, I felt ethically, as long as I depicted it in such a way to show that it was 40 years ago, it was a very fixed period in time when they were both miserably unhappy and our family was coming apart. And in the time since then, they've become much different people.
What about the stuff about your father's weird habit of
mooning people?
Yes. Did you think twice about?
No, I mean, you have to understand, I wrote a short piece for Granta for their father's issue about this nude portrait that my father kept in his staircase the whole time I was growing up. Every time we went up and down the stairs, we would walk underneath this sort of like 5 by 8 foot nude portrait of him. And he wasn't just nude once, it was sort of 2 versions of my father. With 2 sets of genitals and everything. So I felt like by writing about it, I wasn't exposing any more than he had already exposed me to as a child.
You're working with such fascinating material in this, and you're such a good writer that you make it as fascinating as it can be. But I wonder if when you were working with it, it never occurred to you maybe to do it as a novel?
I really wanted this to be a memoir. I wanted to write about life. I didn't want it to be mediated that way. In part because my life had sort of collapsed and I was trying to work my way out of this very tough spot, and I couldn't really imagine, life had just closed in, and I wanted to write about life itself. But yeah, it could very easily have wound up in a novel, but it's just not a novel that I wrote.
Any questions? Whoa.
I want to add to what you were saying about taking a single moment that would overwhelm the context that the writer built around it. It's not a question. I have a question. It's what people call taking something out of context. That is exactly the kind of thing that can be used to distort history. What I'm thinking about is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony when the 15th Amendment was passed and black men, I'm sorry, Dr. Lewis, black men were given the vote instead ahead of women, and they exchanged some really furious letters, and called people names in that moment for that reason. And then various other things unfolded, and then they had different attitudes about race as it went on. And if you want to discredit the women's movement, as has been done in several books and endless online things, you take those letters and say, they were all a bunch of racists. But it's exactly what you were describing about. That's how high the stakes are.
Right.
For
Well, I'm thinking even in terms of...
that can be used by itself in a context so entirely different from the way you've placed, and you have no control over it. I do have a question, though. We've talked mostly about ethics as, you started with sexual ethics, but no one's mentioned political ethics.
That's actually something David Lewis was going to talk about in terms of W.E.B. Du Bois and communism. Do you want to address that? I mean,
Particularly?
Well, for example, to be a biographer of Betty Friedan and to harp on her left-wing communist connections. In the same way as what I just described, to make that something that discredits an entire movement. The facts are true, but the emphasis is, to me, unethical.
Well, it's an example.
Political biographies that are out there today suffer from that. That the facts are true, but the interpretations.
the emphasis is off.
And the emphasis and the balance of what's said. A lot of people in the 30s belonged to the Communist Party, so what? That things like that have been used to discredit reputation. I have to give you a long list, but that's my question. The political ethics of work.
Carol?
The question is what you do about it. And I think you have kind of two choices, very broad brush. One goes down the road towards censorship, and the other is that you fight speech with speech. And you respond to scurrilous accusations or disproportionate representations with your own version. Ideally, at least, that's how it takes place. Now, the problem that actually does exist in the world is that some people have much more prominent soapboxes than others, okay? And so the sort of ideal notion that everyone can enter the marketplace with their own idea and have a fair fight of it is often an illusion and a delusion. That's a problem. But my inclination still is that it's better to have a broad marketplace of ideas than to just tell certain people that they have to shut up or clean up their act or what have you. Sure. Yeah, I understand that. But, is it possible to have a conversation about ethics and free speech in the same in the same moment, right? Free speech is notoriously messy, and free speech also, it extends in some cases to falsehood, out and out falsehood. You don't put people in jail typically for telling lies. There may be situations when you can, but it's the exception rather than the rule. And I think on balance in a democracy, it's, that's the better way to keep it.
Anyone else? Yeah.
A quick question, going back to the original premise about
Is she indeed?
A biographer. That's a question that I was thinking about because she forwarded all the emails and interview stuff, and then Vernon Loeb wrote the book, and then she apparently could check things. Whether that gets her off the hook for the adultery part, because she really wasn't the biographer, but I thought that relationship is really very complicated, and to me, she presented herself on TV as the biographer and all of that.
Well, she was the one to do the book tour for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But Carole Broadwell's not a biographer, I don't think, and I don't unless she writes another book. The issue that John raised, I thought we had a terrific example of this in terms of proportion when David Nasser was talking about Joe Kennedy. There's no question that politically Joe Kennedy was anti-Semitic and pro-Hitler for a while. It's also no question that among his closest friends and the very few men he trusted in his life were Jewish. Life is complicated. So if you just look at the way Kennedy has been written, you can change it just by the question of proportion. You focus on the appalling things he said in London about pro-Hitler, anti-Semitic, and that's him. He's a vicious anti-Semite. Apologists, I imagine his daughter Jean might look at his relationships, his other relationships, and try to purify him of the accusation. But I think all you can do as a biographer, if you're serious about it, is acknowledge the complexity of him and put it all down there, because that's what's interesting about him, that he's in the one-dimensional.
Is that somebody?
Yeah, well, somebody else. Yeah.
I have a question about the judge's findings regarding the authorized status of the biography, writing an authorized biography. I'm left to, it's the good graces of the widow that permits me to quote from unpublished sources, which is part of the book. And yet, I have discovered things that were removed from the journals by her to protect the appearance of how she wishes her husband to be. And these are, crucial facts that expand the reader's understanding. But and of course I can publish the book with the publisher, with this stuff, but she has a right to review the book before it's published, and I anticipate a number of issues raised with her. But I'm also curious about the perception by readers of authorized biography as being somehow tainted by the overbearance of people who are authoring this
that would be unavoidable. I don't see how you could possibly get beyond the fact that the reader knows that you've submitted the manuscript to the subjects.
Well, I have a motivation in a sense to include more salacious material in a sense to somehow redeem myself.
But that would also be unethical if that's your motive.
Yeah, wow.
This is somebody over here. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about the ethics of how you treat your sources. When I interview famous, prominent people as opposed to unfamous, obscure people, I treat their material differently in terms of protection. And I wonder whether, to me, I think where I don't want to reveal things about them, whereas the famous people are more careful.
Right. Well, is your sense of scale influenced by something like New York Times versus Sullivan or something like that, where, it's been a long time since I studied law. And, back in a previous lifetime, I seem to remember the Supreme Court saying that, I think it's the absence of malice standard, right? That you can say pretty much what you want about a public figure as long as actual malice can't be proven, and that's the thing that has kept National Enquirer in business for so many years, and so on and so forth, right? I think you're entitled to assume that a person in public life is more experienced with the press, is going to be more circumspect and a little bit more skilled and a little bit more savvy about how information can be used. And I think that in the case of the typical public figure, though it's not universally true, it's a choice that you make. That you're going to live a certain kind of life, and therefore you have to hold yourself to a different standard of openness versus reticence. And I would hope that most people in public life understand that. I think also, however, that anytime you talk to a biographer, you're a fool if you're completely forthcoming. But I think that you probably factor that in as well. That even from the private person, you're probably not going to get the whole truth. Everybody has a secret that they want to protect, or a loved one that they want to protect. So maybe do what you can.
Okay.
I'm sorry that sort of fizzled out.
Last one.
Biographers work as complex human beings, often as our subjects, and we have mixed feelings about our subjects. Is there an ethical responsibility on the biographer to say something about, in some way, the complex feelings he or she has about the subject? I mean, you've spoken about this now, and you have certain views that sort of guided the way you responded. Many biographers don't address that, but it oozes out of what they write. I'm wondering if that isn't an ethical question that biographers should be asking as they're working. How do I feel about this person? How do I feel it's changing, and so on?
I think it's very, very likely that your feelings about your subject are going to penetrate what you write. Also, that your feelings are going to change over the course of what you write. That certainly happened with me, where I've started with one view of someone and have altered it over time. I think that one writes better biography if one has some notion of respect. And I don't know how I would define that. I would probably, if you asked me to, it would take me 2 years to figure out exactly what I mean by that. But for instance, with my portrayal of Bronson Alcott was a man who was deeply eccentric, whom a lot of people ridiculed in his own time. So what do I do with the fact that he is this potentially ridiculous man? I can sweep his eccentricities under the rug. I don't think that's right for the reader. I can go with the eccentricity and I can laugh at him, as other people did, but that seems mean-spirited. What I ended up doing was to show how he had been ridiculed and misunderstood, but also showing how he responded to it and the grace and dignity with which he responded to people who were, in some instances, very cruel to him. He was generally very stoical and very forgiving. And I think that there was a redemptive quality in trying to view it a little bit from his point of view and thinking, well, how would I feel if people were lambasting me in the streets? There was a joke at the time, what's the difference between Emerson and Alcott? And the answer was, well, Emerson is a seer and Alcott is a seersucker. Okay, and sure, I put that in the book, but with a consciousness of the kind of hurt that something like that could inflict, and then the dilemma that one has, as Bronson Alcott, in responding to it. I don't know if the world would be served by your writing a preface, say, sort of disclosing your feelings toward the subject, because I think that it is going to come out in your writing. And if you do adopt an approach that is disrespectful or angry or unjustifiably filled with levity or something like that. It's going to come through and it's going to make your book less effective. So I think you owe it to yourself, if you want to write a successful book, to write it also in a kind of respectful way. And I can hear in the back of my mind other biographers saying, no, you must not do that. You must respect only the truth or something like that.
I think ultimately you follow the material.
Yeah.
The proposal I wrote for one biography was so completely different than the book I ended up writing because I thought I knew the guy. And then I started interviewing people, and finally you just have to go with the material that you find, that you have. And there's no way of getting around
But
that.
I think that can be the help that a good reader or editor can do, and just push you on certain points. Do you really want to say it this way? Not to sanitize it, but to pick out those parts where your feelings get the better of you, and that you really do want to say this, but in a different way. And maybe it's a collaboration if you have a good editor or good reader who can do that with you, because I agree. You do, and some of the biographies you read, you know that this person is just really annoyed. The biographer is really annoyed with this person, if not angry with them. Well, okay, I mean, I'm not interested in you. I'm interested in the person you're writing about. So I think there are ways around it.
Carol, you got the last word.
Oh, I did.
Thank
Okay.
you, Ben. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, John. Thank you all for coming.